Welcome back, everybody. Today we're tackling something that might sound a bit, well, boring at first glance. But stick with us.
Yeah, it gets pretty fascinating.
We're diving deep into research waste in clinical trials.
Those studies that test, if new treatments are safe and actually work.
Exactly. And you might be surprised to learn that a ton of info from these trials just disappears, vanishes.
Poof, gone.
It's wild. So we're going to break down why that's a problem, what causes it, and what's being done about it.
We've got a lot to cover.
And luckily, I have an expert here to help us navigate this whole thing.
Happy to be here.
So let's set the scene for our listeners. Imagine you're a doctor. You're trying to figure out the absolute best treatment for your patient.
Important decision.
You're looking at the most recent research. But here's the catch. A big chunk of relevant studies never actually got published.
That's research waste in action.
That's a problem. To understand how big of a deal this is, let's walk through, the ideal journey of a clinical trial. What are the major steps from that first idea to hopefully getting it published?
Okay, so first you got to identify what you're even researching. Then you design the study super carefully. You figure out, who's going to be in it, what exactly are you testing, and how will you measure if it works.
That's pretty detailed.
Oh, yeah. And crucially, you register the trial in a public database. This helps keep things transparent and make sure other researchers aren't doing the same thing.
Avoids duplicating efforts. Smart.
Totally. From there, you got to recruit people to participate, run the trial, collect all that data.
The nitty-gritty.
And then you analyze all that to answer your initial research question. And finally, fingers crossed, you write up your findings and try to get it published in a scientific journal so everyone can see the results.
Makes it public. Got it. And there's a timeline for this, right? Especially for reporting the findings.
The World Health Organization, the WHO, they recommend publishing results within 1 year of the study ending. That's kind of the gold standard.
Seems reasonable. But what I've been reading suggests the reality isn't quite so ideal.
Yeah, unfortunately. Studies show that between 25% to a whopping 62% of trials don't meet that guideline.
That's a huge gap.
Huh?
What's going on there? What causes that massive difference in reporting rates?
A bunch of things, honestly. For one, different parts of the world have different rules about reporting. Some places, like the U.S., you have to report results. It's the law. Other places, it's more of a suggestion.
So some folks just skip it.
Pretty much. Then there's publication bias, where journals tend to favor studies with positive findings, exciting breakthroughs. That means negative results, or studies that show no effect are less likely to get published.
So we're not just missing data, we're getting a skewed view of what we actually know.
Exactly. And then there are the researchers themselves. Sometimes it's a lack of awareness. They might not fully understand the guidelines or how important it is to report everything.
I guess it could be overwhelming.
Plus, time crunches and coordinating with everyone involved can be a real pain.
Makes sense. So we've got these big systemic issues, but also individual roadblocks. Before we get to potential solutions, let's break down this research waste problem even more. You mentioned it briefly, but how can a trial go off the rails on its way to publication? What are those specific pitfalls?
Well, it starts right at the beginning. Not every trial that should be registered actually is. And even when they are, there's no guarantee they include all the important details or that they're updated properly.
So we're off to a shaky start already.
Right. And even those databases themselves can be a mess. Missing data, inconsistent formatting, all that makes it harder for people to actually use the information.
Sounds like a headache.
Some researchers publish detailed plans for their trial beforehand, but it's not everyone. And even when a study gets published, we've still got to watch out for selective reporting,
Meaning?
where they highlight only the good results. Or they're hesitant to share their raw data so others can analyze it.
So even well-intentioned studies face a ton of obstacles. Let's go back to not publishing results, because that feels like the biggest issue. What are the consequences of that beyond just losing information?
Honestly, it's an ethical problem. Researchers make a promise to participants who volunteer their time, and sometimes put their health on the line, to contribute to science. If results aren't shared, that's breaking that promise.
It's like leaving a story unfinished.
And it's not cheap either.
Yeah.
All that research costs money. Our source material says that not being able to access research findings wastes a huge chunk of the, about $240 billion spent annually on healthcare research worldwide.
Whoa. That's a lot of wasted potential.
One source said it perfectly. By failing to contribute to knowledge, unpublished studies represent a complete lack of return on the investment of research resources and the contributions of study participants.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Every unpublished study is wasted money, time, effort, and maybe even missed opportunities to make healthcare better. Okay, so we've laid out the problem pretty clearly, but let's flip it for a second. What are the good things that happen when results are published the right way? What's in it for patients, doctors, researchers, even the people funding these studies?
Tons of benefits. The CTTI, that group we mentioned earlier, they summed it up well. For patients, it means they have the power to make informed choices about their health.
Because they know what the research actually says.
Right. And they can even find and join trials that might help them. For doctors, it keeps them up to date on the latest findings and makes sure research is done ethically.
Everyone wins. What about researchers and the folks who fund these studies? Why should they care about transparency?
Well, being open about trials actually helps researchers recruit participants and avoid wasting time on redundant studies.
Makes sense. Less wheel reinventing.
Exactly. Plus, it highlights areas where more research is needed, so everyone's using their resources more wisely.
So a more transparent system helps everyone.
Big time. But the question is, how big is this non-publication problem? Is this a global thing?
I was just wondering that.
There are actually a bunch of studies that try to answer that. They've looked at data from the US, Germany, Canada, and the Nordic countries, tracking how many trials publish results within a year of finishing.
Interesting. Did some countries do better than others?
The results are all over the place, honestly. Compliance with that one-year recommendation ranged from like 2% to 40%, depending on the country and when the study was done.
That's a big difference. Anything else interesting pop up in those studies, like trends over time?
The US and Germany had studies covering a longer period, so those are interesting. Germany's reporting rates only went up by 4% over 8 years.
Not great. How about the U.S.?
The US did much better. Their rates increased by almost 25% over a similar time frame, probably because of new laws and stricter enforcement.
So rules and consequences actually work.
Seems like it. One other interesting tidbit. Trials funded by industry, like pharmaceutical companies, had better reporting rates than those funded by, non-industry sources.
That's curious. Why is that?
It could be a few reasons. Industry sponsors tend to have more resources and set procedures for reporting. Plus, they probably don't want bad publicity for not complying.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got a global snapshot of the problem. But now the big question, why? Why are so many research results just disappearing?
Well, there's no single answer. It's complicated. But our source material points to three main culprits: inconsistent enforcement of the rules, the tendency to only publish positive results, and surprisingly, researchers just not knowing how important it is to report all their findings.
That's a great starting point, and I'm definitely eager to unpack those specific areas. But for now,
Let's hit a pause.
we'll be back in part 2 to really dive into the reasons behind this research black hole.
Yeah, a lot of valuable information slipping through the cracks.
It can be pretty discouraging, but the good news is people are working on solutions.
Absolutely. There's definitely more awareness of the problem and some really promising initiatives popping up.
Okay, I like the sound of that. Tell me more. Where are people making a real difference? Give us some hope.
The UK and the EU have some cool strategies worth highlighting. Back in 2015, the UK's Health Research Authority, they call it the HRA, launched a national strategy all about transparency in research.
Sounds ambitious. What's at the heart of their approach?
They've linked ethics approval for trials to trial registration. Basically, researchers can't get the okay to start a trial unless it's properly registered in a legit database. They use the ISRCTN registry.
So they're building accountability right into the process from day one.
Exactly. That way, the HRA has a complete picture of all the clinical research happening in the UK. It's so much easier to track and follow up on whether those results are actually reported.
Smart move. But do they just leave it at that? Or are they actively checking to make sure researchers are reporting their findings?
Oh, they're proactive.
Yeah.
A year after a study's done, the HRA checks to see if the results are in the registry. If not, they send a little reminder to the lead researcher.
A friendly nudge. But what's stopping researchers from just ignoring those reminders?
The HRA does regular audits to monitor compliance, so they're not just sending emails and hoping for the best, they're actively checking in.
That's pretty well organized. So the UK is all about linking ethics approval and registration. What about the EU? How are they tackling this problem?
They did something big in 2022. They implemented the clinical trials regulation. This whole thing aims to make it easier to get approval for clinical trials across all the EU member states.
That sounds like a massive undertaking. How does that work in reality?
They created the Clinical Trials Information System, or CTIS for short. It's this online platform where sponsors can apply for regulatory approval with just one application. No more jumping through hoops in each individual country.
Ah, so it's streamlined, like a one-stop shop for trial approval.
You got it. And it has benefits beyond just convenience. It means more transparency and consistent standards for quality across all EU clinical trials.
Raising the bar for research throughout the region.
Exactly. And like the UK's HRA, the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, they keep track of reporting too. They send reminders to sponsors who haven't reported their findings on time.
So both the UK and the EU are actively involved, not just setting rules, but enforcing them. The big question is it working?
It's too soon to tell definitively. We need more time to see the long-term impact of these strategies. The data's not in yet.
So we're waiting to see, but at least these are concrete steps in the right direction.
That's the encouraging part. People are recognizing the problem and actually trying to fix it. But of course, we can always do more.
Definitely. So beyond these big national and regional initiatives, what else can be done to address those root causes of research waste we talked about? What about scientific journals? Can they do more?
For sure. Journals have a big role to play. They can encourage researchers to publish all findings, not just the positive ones, by prioritizing transparency and completeness.
So moving away from that publish or perish pressure that often leads researchers to only focus on the exciting, positive results.
Exactly. And some journals are already doing this. They're creating sections specifically for negative or null results and encouraging researchers to register their trial protocols before they even begin. That increases transparency from the get-go.
That's great. What about the researchers themselves? How can they contribute to a more transparent research culture?
Plenty of ways. First off, they can embrace the idea that all findings are important and that a complete picture of the evidence is key. Sharing their data and protocols openly also encourages collaboration and scrutiny.
So shifting from a culture of secrecy to a more open, collaborative one.
That's a big part of it. And education is key. Research institutions can play a vital role by teaching researchers about reporting guidelines, ethical considerations, and how to share data effectively.
Giving them the tools and knowledge to do the right thing.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the funding agencies. They can use their influence to incentivize transparency. They can require grantees to follow reporting guidelines and make funding decisions based on open science practices.
So using their financial clout to drive positive change, it seems like everyone involved in research has a role to play in creating a more transparent and accountable system.
It's definitely a team effort. At the end of the day, it's about changing the research culture. We need to prioritize transparency, integrity, and using research findings responsibly.
We've covered a lot today. We've gone from the depths of this research black hole to the glimmers of hope on the horizon. What are some key takeaways you want our listeners to remember, especially if they're thinking about participating in a trial themselves?
Be an informed consumer of research. Don't just take what you read at face value. Be critical. Ask questions. Think about where the information is coming from.
Don't just blindly trust everything you see.
Right. And if you're considering joining a clinical trial, do your research. Ask about the trial's registration status if they plan to publish the results, and understand your rights as a participant.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Absolutely. And remember, your participation in research is super valuable, but those results need to be shared openly and used responsibly to benefit everyone.
Great advice. Well, we've explored this hidden world of research waste, its impact, and some potential solutions. But as we discussed, it's still early days for those solutions. We've got a lot to think about.
Lots of questions still unanswered.
And thankfully, we have one more part of this episode to do just that. Join us after the break as we unpack what we've learned and imagine what the future of research transparency could look like.
We're back, and I gotta say, this deep dive into research waste has been, well, a real eye-opener.
It's definitely more complex than meets the eye.
We've seen how valuable information can just disappear. We've talked about the ethical problems, and thankfully, we've seen how some people are trying to fix the system.
Lots of work still to do, though, for sure. And as we said, it's too early to tell if those solutions will actually work.
Yeah, we need more time, more data.
But that's the thing about tackling big problems. There's rarely an easy fix.
It's a process.
Exactly. But acknowledging the problem, starting the conversation, that's huge.
Definitely a good first step.
And that's what we're trying to do with this deep dive, getting people to think, to ask questions, maybe even feel empowered to, demand better.
I like that.
So, with that in mind, time for our final thought-provoking question, something for our listeners to chew on. What's the challenge you want to leave them with?
All right. We talked about how unpublished research can really mess with our understanding of how treatments work. It could even lead to some bad, even harmful choices.
That's scary.
So knowing that, how can we as a society do a better job of encouraging the publication of all research findings, good, bad, even the inconclusive ones?
That's a really good question. It makes you think about the motivations behind research. Is it about how funding works?
Oh.
Or ethical guidelines? Maybe even public pressure?
All of those. Maybe. It might take a combination of things. We might need to rethink how we define what makes research valuable, recognizing that every study teaches us something, even if the results aren't what we expected.
It's like science isn't about always being right. It's about constantly building on what we know, even when the evidence challenges our assumptions.
Exactly. And it's about valuing the contributions of everyone involved in research, the participants, the researchers, making sure their work is shared openly. That's how we honor their commitment.
Beautifully said. Well, we've spent this episode exploring this hidden world of research waste. We've looked at the impact, the ethics, and we've seen some possible solutions.
It's a start.
It is. And the journey towards more transparency, more accountability in research, it's far from over. But hopefully our listeners feel a little more informed, a little more motivated to be part of the solution.
I hope so too.
Thanks for joining us. And a huge thanks to our expert for all the insights.
My pleasure.
And until next time, keep asking those questions, keep learning, and as always, keep diving deep.